Chronic traumatic encephalopathy. It's degenerative, and it is now believed to be caused by repeated blows to the head.
Antonio Brown, once a surefire Hall of Fame inductee and one of the best wide receivers in the NFL's modern era, devolved into a widely disgraced player who's barred almost entirely from the NFL. But how did this happen? The fall of Antonio Brown is a story that's incredibly puzzling, and even after being months removed from the series of events that transpired, a lot of us are still scratching our heads wondering how it all even managed to happen in the first place. So today, I want to delve deeper into the inner workings of Antonio Brown and really attempt to pinpoint where everything went wrong for him and what caused his downfall. But before we get going here, I want to quickly mention that only a small percentage of the people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you end up enjoying this video, please do consider subscribing to keep up with my content. Now, to gain an understanding of how Antonio Brown's rapid descent even happened in the first place, we first need to gain an understanding of Antonio Brown and really what makes him tick. And it all starts with Antonio's formative years. Things were rough for Antonio Brown growing up. Born into poverty, Antonio lived in the midst of gang violence throughout his youth. And on top of that, he was estranged from his father, Eddie Brown, when he was 8 years old and had a strained relationship with his mother as well, which would ultimately culminate when he became homeless at the age of 16. It's safe to say that Antonio's environment growing up took a serious toll on him, becoming a source for many of his lifelong demons. And rather than facing these demons head on, a young Antonio Brown would look to football to get away from them, following in the footsteps of his estranged father, Eddie Brown, who was a legendary football player in his own right, being honored as the greatest Arena Football League player ever in 2006. Antonio would start his football career at Miami Norland, playing as the team's starting quarterback, putting up big numbers and earning several accolades along the way. However, while he excelled on the gridiron, the classroom was a different story, and this, along with problematic scouting interviews, would keep him initially from gaining the recognition he deserved heading into his college years. He would manage to boost his test scores and subsequently earn a scholarship from FIU, but his demons would follow him to FIU as he would find himself involved in an on-campus altercation that ended with his scholarship being rescinded and school officials telling Brown that they were just gonna say he was never there. And seemingly with all of his options exhausted, Brown returned home to Miami. But his story doesn't end here, as he'd get a chance from Central Michigan to come on as a walk-on wide receiver, where he'd go on to become the school's all-time reception leader and top 3 in all-time receiving yards and touchdowns. Antonio Brown would declare for the 2010 NFL Draft after 3 years at Central Michigan, where he would be picked up in the 6th round by the Pittsburgh Steelers with the 195th pick of the draft. And after training camp, Brown would be named the Steelers' 5th wide receiver on the depth chart, along with being the team's designated return man. In the following years, he'd work his way up the depth chart, and eventually, when Mike Wallace declined to sign a new contract with Pittsburgh, the Steelers would approach Brown with offers of a long-term contract. However, following his signing, what was once a mild-mannered Antonio Brown, working tirelessly for even a sliver of recognition, would soon be enveloped by his demons. Outbursts became the new norm, and over the next few years, we'd see glimpses here and there of what the Steelers were dealing with internally when it came to Antonio Brown. Example being when Brown live-streamed the Steelers locker room and Mike Tomlin's speech following their 2017 divisional round win against the Kansas City Chiefs. But again, much of this internal drama was successfully kept out of the public eye. Until 2018, when years of turmoil would ultimately culminate following an altercation with Ben Roethlisberger, which then led Antonio Brown to skipping walkthroughs leading up to a Week 17 matchup against the Cincinnati Bengals. He would subsequently be benched for the matchup, and although the Steelers would manage to win the game, they'd still miss out on the playoffs, with the Ravens edging them out after a win against the Cleveland Browns. This would ultimately be the straw that broke the metaphorical camel's back, and with the bridge between the Steelers and Antonio Brown burnt to a crisp, he was dealt off to the Oakland Raiders for a 3rd and 5th round pick in March of 2018, who would then give Antonio Brown a hefty contract worth $50 million with $30 million guaranteed. However, as we all know now, this was really only the beginning of Antonio Brown's downward spiral into infamy. The offseason would start with Antonio being sidelined due to frostbitten feet, and once he was recovered and ready to play, things would only get worse, with Antonio Brown threatening to retire due to his helmet model being part of a wave of helmet bans during the offseason in an effort to increase player safety. And while the helmet saga would ultimately go out in a whisper, with Antonio Brown abruptly announcing a partnership with Zenith, choosing to wear the Zenith Shadow in 2019, the offseason turmoil would only continue from there, with Antonio being fined for missing team meetings. A fine which he would post a screenshot of on Instagram, which would then lead to the void of his guaranteed money, which would then lead to a confrontation with Mike Mayock, which then led to yet another hefty fine. And while Antonio would issue an apology to Mayock and his teammates following this outburst, he would then turn around and demand to be released, would get released, and then be picked up by the Patriots, all within the span of one day. Are you still with me here? Good, because we're not even close to the end of this. Antonio would sign a $15 million contract with the Patriots, but he'd only play one game, following sexual assault allegations that were levied against him. However, he'd only be released from the team after images were leaked of a string of intimidating texts directed at the accuser and her kids. And I wish I could say we're done, but we're not done here. From Twitter outbursts where he'd blast the NFL and burn almost every bridge imaginable to beefing with Logan Paul, it's safe to say that Antonio Brown would become a fixture of the public eye for months to come, and months of off-the-field antics would ultimately culminate with Antonio Brown being charged for felony burglary after he assaulted a delivery truck driver in early 2020. To think at one point Antonio Brown was not only one of, if not the best wide receiver in the modern era, but he was on track to being one of the greatest wide receivers in NFL history. It's crazy. And he threw it all away, all because he couldn't get his ego in check. Or did he? January 9th, 2016. Wildcard weekend at Paul Brown Stadium. The 12-4 Cincinnati Bengals are set to play host to the 10-6 Pittsburgh Steelers. The Steelers would go on to win this game on a last-second field goal in what would be a low-scoring defensive matchup, earning the right to go lose to Peyton Manning's Broncos the very next week. However, this would have been a very different story had one play just never happened. A play that's now coined as the Burfict hit would put the Steelers in field goal range within the final seconds of the game, allowing for them to advance in the playoffs. But the game winner would come at a cost that would grow more and more significant as the months and years passed on. Many choose to point to this hit when asked to source the downfall of Antonio Brown, claiming that this hit gave him CTE, a neurological disease linked to direct blows to the head. I want to hark back to this hit not because I think it's the source of Antonio Brown's issues, but because I do think that part of the narrative is accurate. CTE is a disease that can't be diagnosed in living beings. However, there are telltale symptoms that range from difficulty thinking and short-term memory loss to emotional instability and impulsive behavior. Symptoms that Antonio Brown has publicly shown in excess. That said, this hit may have amplified existing issues, but as we've already covered, it's not like Antonio Brown had a spotless record prior to this hit. And when it comes down to it, I doubt that all of his issues can be summed up as side effects of CTE. Fact is, Antonio's case is much more nuanced, and he's as much the product of CTE as he is the product of his surroundings growing up. Ultimately, though, people need to understand that Antonio isn't just some overly entitled diva who'll do anything to be in the spotlight. At the end of the day, Antonio Brown crossed the metaphorical diva line many years ago. Antonio Brown is a troubled individual who never learned to deal with his inner demons, and while I'm not here to diagnose anyone, I'd argue it's likely that he's enduring outstanding mental health issues. Now, with all that said, what is Antonio Brown up to now? Well, as of late, Antonio Brown has managed to keep himself in check, going a few months without any significant outbursts. He's as well issued genuine apologies to the Steelers, Raiders, Patriots, and even Ben Roethlisberger in this time. Looking at his Twitter, it looks as if he's dedicated to getting back on track and has goals of getting back into the league sometime soon, even working out with his younger cousin Marquise Brown and Lamar Jackson, which, of course, led to rumblings of the Ravens being interested to bring Antonio in. However, that said, there's a large barrier between Antonio Brown and the NFL, and that barrier is Roger Goodell. Based on his past transgressions along with the NFL's ongoing investigation that Antonio has refused to cooperate with, it's hard to see why Roger Goodell would let him back into the league anytime soon. That said though, AB looks to be on the right path, and I think that with some time, AB could find himself suiting up for an NFL team sometime soon.